One of the most important hooks in all of React has got to be, without question, the useEffect hook. But the problem is, for me personally at least, I actually had a very hard time really wrapping my head around the useEffect hook. I was very confused about how the dependency array works, and in addition to that, I was also very confused about how the cleanup function works. So the goal for this video is to basically demystify the useEffect entirely. I want to make sure that by the time this video is done, you have a full, clear understanding of exactly how this effect works in its entirety, so that you can use it with full confidence. So right from the get-go, there's a few things that I want to establish regarding the useEffect hook. So number one I want to know is, when does it run? Does it run before render, or does it run after render? The second thing I want to establish right away is, how frequently does the useEffect hook run? And as a follow-up to that is, how does the dependency array maybe change that frequency? Does it change the frequency? And if it does, how does it change the frequency? What I have on screen right now to start getting those answers is a very simple code example. So here's the setup. I've got a simple useState hook that I've defined, which is defining a simple name variable. And then I'm taking that name variable and I'm assigning it to the value prop on my input. So essentially I've got an input that is bound to my state. And so the idea here is that as I'm going to go ahead and type into this input, I'm going to then go ahead and update the value of my state, causing a re-render. And then to kind of see when things are running, I've given myself console logs. I've got one console log in my return, right before my return. So in other words, in my render, and then another console log in my useEffect. So the idea basically is I'm going to be able to go into my input, start typing, and then look at the console logs, and from that I can then figure out two things. Number one, did the render happen before the useEffect, or did the useEffect happen before the render? And then also, how many times did the useEffect actually run? So let's go ahead and type into the input and actually start getting some answers. So here we go. We already started getting some basic answers. I've now typed my name into the input, and you can see first things first, the render is the first console log that runs before the effect. So we already established one thing right off the bat. The useEffect happens after render. So the order of operations is going to be render, then useEffect. But the other thing that we've established now is that in the event when we actually don't pass any kind of dependency array, which is our case here, you can see that with the useEffect, there's no dependency array being passed in the useEffect. What's going to happen is the useEffect will run every single time the component re-renders. So in our case, every single keystroke that I'm typing into the input, I'm causing another render to happen in my component. So the order of operations is going to be render, effect, once for every single time that the component goes ahead and re-renders. So now that we've established this, let's now go ahead and take it a step further and see what happens in the event that we are going to pass the dependency array, but we're going to keep the array empty. So here you can now see that this setup is actually very similar to the setup that we had before. The only key difference now is we're actually passing an array to our useEffect hook, and the array in this case is actually empty. So let's once again go back to the input, type something in, and see what happens. So now you can actually see that what happened is I've typed into my input, and instead of actually getting the console log and the effect to run, that one actually never ran. The only thing that ran, of course, is going to be the console log that is in my render. So this actually now makes it seem like the useEffect hook doesn't run at all, but that wouldn't actually be the full story. Let's see what happens when I actually go ahead and refresh this page. So now when I refresh this page, you can see that I first get render, and then I get the effect. And then if I go back to my input and I start typing, now I only get the render, but I don't get the effect. So here's basically what the empty dependency array means. The empty dependency array will basically tell the useEffect, I want you to only run after the initial page load. That means a person comes to this page for the first time. They've not even interacted with the page just yet. The order of operations is now going to be get render, initial render, the initial page load, if you will. Then the useEffect is going to fire, and then we can start interacting with those pages. Now, as the user starts interacting with the pages, the empty dependency array will basically tell the useEffect you can ignore all those sort of subsequent renders. I want you to only worry about the first render, that initial page load, but everything that happens after that you can totally ignore, and you can see that here. We got the render, we got the useEffect. This is all happening from the first page load. Then I started interacting by typing into my input. Then I kept only getting the render, but the effect never ran again. And once again, this is because I've given it an empty dependency array.
Hey, sorry to interrupt your video. Really sorry, but Salesman Chaim here, okay? Just really quickly, got to tell you about this really cool thing that I now offer. I just want to let you know that you can now go down to the description box below and find a link to codingwithchaim.dev. All you got to do is head over to that link, and you're going to find that you can now schedule a one-on-one mentoring session with me. So what that means is when you head on over there, choose a time that makes sense for you, fill in the form, tell me exactly how I can help. You could include topics like React, JavaScript, mock interviews, career advice, and more. And then you and I will be in a one-on-one meeting together, and I'll be there to help you solve your problems. So don't delay. Very minimal sessions available. Go down to that link and go ahead and book your first session. Back to the video.
So now that we've established that an empty dependency array will only let it run once and only once an initial page load, let's now see what happens when we don't give it an empty array, but rather we actually pass a value to this array. So now you can see that this setup is almost identical to the setup that we had before. The key difference here is the array before was empty, now it's not empty, but instead the very variable that we're actually updating when we're typing into our input is the variable that we're going to be passing to the dependency array of our useEffect. So let's now go back to our input, type something and then see what happens. So now you can see that much like in the case when we had no dependency array, we actually get an effect and a render once for every single time that the component re-renders, meaning every single time that we're typing in, the component re-renders again, we get a render and then we get an effect. So now we're establishing that when you actually pass a variable into your useEffect, the variable will then cause, if that variable changes, will then cause this useEffect to go ahead and run again and again and again every single time that this particular variable changes. So now let's start diving into this cleanup function. When does this cleanup function actually run? Okay, so now you can see that I'm actually defining the cleanup function, which is defined by basically returning a function. So in the useEffect, you return a function, and then whatever you put inside of that function will happen whenever the cleanup runs. Now the question is, when does this cleanup actually run? So let's first go ahead and refresh this page, and let's determine whether or not the cleanup function actually runs on the initial page load. Okay, so here we can now see something very interesting. We've got the render running, we've got the inEffect running, but the cleanup function actually didn't run. So we've now established that the cleanup function does not run on initial page load. So let's see, when does it actually run? Now that I've typed into my input, now let's actually read through the console logs. So we see that we get render first, then cleanup, and then we get the effect. So now we're starting to kind of get a bit of a picture here. So this is what happens. When you first get through a page load, meaning when you first render the page for the first time, at that point we've already established we get the render, then we get the effect, but we get no cleanup. The cleanup only happens in all sort of subsequent renders. That means that after the page is loaded, after we get that first render, after we got that first effect, and now the user is basically taking some interaction. So like in our case, we start typing into the input, and we're causing further subsequent renders. Now the cleanup will start running, but it's going to run after the render, before the effect. So I think now that we've seen the order of operations of when the useEffect runs and how the dependency array changes it, and also how the cleanup function kind of comes into play, I think we're now ready to kind of take all of those concepts together and go ahead and build something a little bit more advanced within React using the concepts that we just learned. So here's what I want to do. Have you ever heard of a debounced input, right? So the scenario here is basically like this. Let's imagine that you have this input that you can type into the input, and then basically as you're typing, you're going to go ahead and fire off like a request to your server to go ahead and search for data in your database based on what the user is typing. Now, one of the obvious things that is very common that you don't want to do is you don't want to make it that every single keystroke goes ahead and fires off another request to the server, because of course that can be pretty plentiful, that's going to be pretty heavy on the server, and that's just something that we don't want to do. Ideally, what we want to do is we basically want to debounce. So debounce basically is that as you're basically typing into the input, we're not going to do anything. We're going to wait for you to stop typing for X amount of time. It could be 100 milliseconds, 200 milliseconds, whatever you basically decide, and then once that amount of time is basically elapsed, at that point we then go ahead and fire off your request to the server, searching for whatever you have in the database based on what you've typed into the input. So we're going to go ahead and mimic that behavior right now, and we're going to do all of that using nothing more than a useEffect. Based on the concepts that we just learned about useEffect, this is actually very, very simple to do. Let me show you how. I have a variable in state called name, and then I've got an input that is bound to this name variable of state. And so then the idea basically is that as I'm going to go ahead and type into this input, I have passed this name variable to my useEffect dependency array, and then within it, I'm updating a different bit of state called output. And the idea is very simple. I'm going to take whatever you've typed, and I'm going to go ahead and display it on screen in its uppercase version. So this is what it looks like. See, as I'm typing, on every single keystroke, we then see the output, but now we're actually seeing it in its uppercase form. Now let's pretend for the sake of this video that this is a very expensive operation, and it's the kind of thing that we would not want to do in a sort of every single keystroke. Instead, we want to do it in a debounce. Let me show you exactly how we would do that. So on screen right now, I have the code of my debounced input. So let's examine this code and see exactly how it works. So the first thing that I'm doing is right outside of my component, I'm defining a variable called timer. Then what I'm doing is I've got this useEffect, and I'm telling this useEffect to run every single time that the name variable changes. Now what happens is when the user is actually typing into this input, they're going to be updating the value of name, and then that's the variable that I'm passing to my array of my useEffect. So effectively, I'm telling this useEffect that whenever the user is typing into the input, go ahead and rerun the useEffect. Now if you recall, we just said earlier, in the useEffect on all subsequent renders, meaning as the user is already taking some kind of interaction, which in our case will be typing into this input, the cleanup function will run before the actual body of the useEffect. Now let's keep that in mind for this next very important point. This is how a debounce is supposed to work. Basically, I don't want to allow this operation to happen so long as the user is still typing. While the user is still typing, don't go ahead and transform their value to the uppercase version of their value. I don't want that to happen while they're typing. Rather, I want them to wait until after we're done typing for X amount of time, which in my case will be 350 milliseconds, and then go ahead and take the actual operation. So here's how this code flows. Basically, they type, they're updating the value of name, which means that we're looking at this name variable right over here. We go into the useEffect. The first thing that happens when a useEffect runs on subsequent renders, meaning based on a user interaction, is we first do the cleanup function. So in my case, I'm going to go ahead and clear out the timer. Now, if I clear out the timer, that means that that timer will never actually have a chance to reach its delay of 350 milliseconds. Therefore, whatever function I've passed into the set timeout will never actually happen. So the thought process here is that so long as the user keeps typing, which means the name variable keeps updating, we're going to keep clearing out all the most recent timers. And then the next thing that happens is after we clear the timer, we go ahead and define a new timer. If I stop typing, that means the most recent timer that I just created won't actually get cleared because my useEffect won't run because the name variable didn't actually change. And then finally, we can wait for that delay of 350 milliseconds. And when that delay elapses, when that timer passes, now our operation is going to actually happen. So let's actually see this in action. So long as I'm typing, nothing's happening. And the reason why nothing's happening is because I'm typing, the name variable is changing, and then we keep clearing out the timer. But when I stop typing, then the amount of time passes, and then finally we see our value has been displayed on screen to its uppercase form. So if you like videos like this and you want to learn more about React and you want to get a much deeper understanding of React, I've got an entire playlist for you to enjoy. You can click on it right over here, go watch this playlist, enjoy, and level up your React skills.